Here's one fact about Jews in America that I bet you don't know. The first Jews arrived in what is today the United States of America in the 1650s. They didn't stay long though. Not most of them anyway. So who were these early Jewish settlers, and why did they come to America? What was life like for them here? And how did their American experience begin and end? This is the story of America's first Jewish settlers. I'm the host. This series explores the heritage of the American people. This episode is brought to you by the National Museum of American Jewish History. Check out their website for more information. In 1654, 23 Jewish refugees fleeing persecution in Portuguese Brazil landed in New Amsterdam, the Dutch colony that would later become New York. Colonial officials were suspicious of these interlopers and did not want to admit them. But after some negotiation, the group was allowed to stay. Over the next several decades, small numbers of Jews settled throughout the American colonies. In 1658, 11 Portuguese Jews arrived in the town of Newport, Rhode Island, which at the time was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They had traveled from London, England, where many had converted to Christianity in order to escape anti-Jewish persecution there. However, as soon as they set foot in New Amsterdam, they were arrested for practicing Judaism. Although the colony's governor later apologized for this action and granted them freedom of religion, all but one of the group chose to depart for the relative tolerance of Rhode Island. That one person was an enslaved West Indian man named Uri, who became America's first Jewish slave. He remained in New Amsterdam until his death around 1674. Several years later, in 1664, an influx of Sephardic Jews arrived in Charleston, South Carolina, having been expelled from the Spanish colony of Jamaica. In total, nearly 70 Sephardic Jews settled in Charleston during this period. Many were wealthy merchants, including 2 prominent members of the local government. A few years after their arrival, the colonists were so enamored with the cultural contributions of the Jewish community that they exempted it from paying taxes in perpetuity. Also in 1664, the English took New Amsterdam from the Dutch and renamed it New York in honor of the Duke of York. This led to speculation that America's first synagogue was established in New York in 1664. However, the oldest surviving record of a Jewish house of worship in North America is a bill for repairs at the Mikveh Israel Synagogue in Philadelphia. It was dated 1681. Jews continued to migrate to Philadelphia over the next few decades, attracted by William Penn's vision of religious tolerance and economic opportunity. By 1700, the city was home to a thriving Jewish community and America's first full-time Jewish minister. Meanwhile, in the Georgia colony, another Jewish community was taking root in the city of Savannah. Like their counterparts in Philadelphia, these Jews also fled persecution in Europe, crossing the Atlantic in the early 1730s from England and Germany. Despite living thousands of miles away from each other, these scattered Jewish communities forged connections through trade and family ties. When news reached Savannah of the flourishing Jewish community in Philadelphia, a delegation of 5 men journeyed north to establish a relationship. This delegation played an essential role in laying the groundwork for a Jewish federation along the Atlantic coast, an early form of a Jewish state that would eventually encompass all of the United States. Life for these colonial Jews varied, depending on their location and the time period. Early Jews in America were predominantly men, most of them in their 20s or older. While the reasons for migration differed among them, most were looking for better economic opportunities. In general, they lived as merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, and laborers, often working in the same fields as non-Jews. Their communities were tight-knit, characterized by strong family bonds and mutual aid, and defined by their commitment to religious observance. Prayer groups led by lay leaders conducted religious services in private homes and followed Ashkenazi customs. While these communities flourished, anti-Jewish prejudice also existed in colonial America. For example, in 1698, the governor of New York barred Jews from serving in public office, owning land, and even testifying in court. Despite such discrimination, by the end of the 17th century, Jews in America had become an integral part of colonial society. They participated actively in civic affairs and contributed significantly to the economic growth of their communities. The seeds of a distinct American Jewish identity were also beginning to take root. But as the 18th century dawned, the lives of American Jews were about to change dramatically. The Great Migration of Jews to America began in the late 1700s and early 1800s. During this period, waves of European Jews arrived in the United States seeking refuge from persecution and hoping for new opportunities. Among them were some of the most prominent figures in American Jewish history, such as Haym Salomon, who financed much of the American Revolution and served as George Washington's financial agent. One of the most well-known stories from this era is that of the Jews of Savannah. As we mentioned earlier, they came to Savannah in the early 1730s and quickly established themselves as successful merchants and artisans. However, in 1740, a yellow fever epidemic struck the city, killing over 500 people, including 8 of the Jewish community. Despite their loss, the Jewish survivors refused to abandon the city. Instead, they reached out to their coreligionists in Philadelphia and Charleston for assistance. In response, the two communities sent supplies and medical professionals to aid the sick. After the epidemic subsided, the Savannah Jews rebuilt their community and continued to thrive. Another pivotal moment for American Jews occurred during the American Revolution. Jews from all over the colonies participated in the war effort, both militarily and financially. Haym Salomon, a Jewish merchant from Philadelphia, played a crucial role in financing the war and served as George Washington's financial agent. His efforts helped secure the victory of the American cause and establish the United States as a nation that welcomed religious diversity. Following the American Revolution, Jews continued to face challenges. Anti-Jewish stereotypes and legal restrictions persisted, particularly in the southern states. But despite these obstacles, Jewish life in America flourished. Communities grew, synagogues were built, and Jewish leaders continued to contribute to American society. For example, in 1790, the Shearith Israel Congregation was founded in New York City. This congregation, which still stands today, played a significant role in shaping American Jewish life and culture. Similarly, in 1824, the first Reformed synagogue in the United States was established in Charleston, South Carolina. This marked a shift in American Jewish life towards Reformed Judaism, which emphasized reason and social justice. By the early 1800s, American Jews had become an integral part of American life. They participated actively in politics, business, and philanthropy, and made significant contributions to the nation's cultural and intellectual development. So while America's first Jews didn't stay long, those that came after them certainly did. Their collections span over 300 years of American Jewish life, from colonial times to the present day, and individuals in American Jewish history, such as the 1715 London Hebrew Bible, one of only 3 known copies, and a letter written by President Harry Truman announcing his support for the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. There you can see iconic artifacts such as the Torah rescued from a burning synagogue in Eastern Europe and brought to America in 1940, as well as personal items from American Jewish heroes such as Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis and Nobel Prize-winning scientist Albert Sabin. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to this channel for more videos about the heritage of the American people. Do you want to know who helped America win the Revolutionary War? You might be thinking of Paul Revere or the other guys that are always showing up on those History Channel documentaries. But if you think about it, those guys were just like a rounding error compared to the real people responsible for winning the war. And no, I'm not talking about George Washington. No one really knows what he was doing most of the time anyway. You see, there was a group of Jews who came from all over Europe and who risked their lives and fortunes to help make America what it is today. Theirs is an untold story that played a crucial role in shaping the very foundations of the United States. So here's a brief history of the Jews in America during the Revolutionary Era, starting with the most famous Jewish American of them all, Haym Salomon. Haym Salomon was a Jewish immigrant from Bavaria who made his fortune in the fur trade. He was born in 1740 and by his early 20s had moved to Charleston where he started his business. By 1775, when the Revolutionary War broke out, Salomon was well established in the city. He was also married to a Christian woman named Elizabeth, who converted to Judaism after giving birth to their first child. This is actually the first documented case of intermarriage between Christians and Jews in the British North American colonies. Salomon was a patriot, and he used his wealth and influence to support the cause, but not in the way that most people expected. Most people think that the patriots simply did unlike the king and wanted to get rid of him so they could have more autonomy, but the reality was much more complex than that. See, while some patriots like Samuel Adams wanted full-blown independence from Britain, others like John Hancock wanted to remain within the empire but with greater representation and rights. Solomon was one of these people. He believed that American colonies should have greater autonomy from Britain, but he did not believe that they should be fully independent. He hoped that by supporting the patriots and helping them achieve their goals, he could secure a place for himself and his family in the new government that would surely emerge. But as the war dragged on and the Americans suffered defeat after defeat at the hands of the British, Solomon began to have second thoughts. In 1778, he wrote to a friend in London, "I must tell you candidly that I have been disappointed in the conduct of some of our leaders. I begin to fear that independence is a species of madness." However, despite his misgivings about the war, Solomon continued to support the patriots financially. He understood that if the Americans were to win the war, then they would need to have strong leadership in order to forge a new nation. And he believed that he could play a part in shaping that new government by supporting the patriots now. In 1779, Solomon was appointed to the committee to purchase stores for the state of South Carolina, and he used this position to great effect. He established supply depots across the South and negotiated with European merchants to provide the patriots with much-needed goods. He also provided financial assistance to the Continental Army, purchasing supplies and weapons, and even paying soldiers' salaries. It is estimated that he provided over $600,000 in today's money to the war effort. When Charleston fell to the British in 1780, Solomon was forced to flee to Philadelphia with his family. There he continued his work, purchasing supplies and recruiting soldiers for the Continental Army. He also helped draft the Jewish contribution to the 1776 Declaration of Independence, although historians can't agree whether or not this actually happened. But regardless, he continued to do his best to help the fledgling United States survive. After the war, Solomon was rewarded with a seat in the Continental Congress, and he used his position to advocate for the rights of Jews in the new nation. He helped draft the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which guaranteed religious freedom in the Western Territories. And he worked to ensure that Jews were included in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Sadly, Solomon died in 1786 before seeing these efforts come to fruition. But his legacy lived on as the first Jewish American millionaire and one of the wealthiest members of the Continental Congress. During the Revolutionary War, there was another group of Jews who also helped the United States. These were the Jewish refugees from England who settled in Philadelphia and contributed to the war effort in a different way. As loyalists, they used their knowledge of the British Empire to smuggle supplies into the city, evade British patrols, and keep the city supplied with food and other necessities. They also served as couriers, carrying messages between the Continental Congress and other patriots throughout the war. One such courier was Jacob Franks, who completed over 30 missions without ever being caught. Another was Gershom Mendez Seixas, who served on the Committee of Correspondence and helped coordinate the boycott of British goods in the colonies. These Jewish refugees were essential to the survival of Philadelphia during the Revolutionary War. Without their help, the British may have starved out the city, which would have had a devastating impact on the war effort. Although they were loyalists, these Jews were still able to contribute to the founding of the United States. And after the war, many of them became naturalized citizens. The third and final group of Jews who helped America during the Revolutionary Era were the enslaved Jews who escaped from their masters and joined the Continental Army. The exact number of enslaved Jews who fought for the United States is unknown, but historians estimate that it was in the hundreds. Enslaved Jews were a part of every colonial army, and they fought alongside other enslaved people of African descent in the struggle for independence. They were motivated by the promise of freedom that was enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, and they hoped to create a new nation where slavery would be abolished. Enslaved Jews fought in a variety of roles, including as soldiers, spies, and servants. They were often assigned to labor battalions where they worked as cooks, carpenters, and teamsters. But many enslaved Jews also served as soldiers, fighting in battles across the colonies. They were usually armed with muskets, and they were trained in basic military maneuvers. Enslaved Jews also served as spies, gathering intelligence for the Continental Army. They were able to move around freely in enemy territory, and they were often able to obtain information that would have been impossible for white spies to get. Sadly, despite their contributions to the war effort, enslaved Jews were not granted freedom after the war. The United States was founded as a nation that was built on the principles of liberty and equality. But those principles did not extend to enslaved people. In fact, the institution of slavery continued to thrive in the United States for another half-century. Enslaved Jews were forced to live under the same brutal conditions as other enslaved people in the United States. And it wasn't until the Civil War that slavery was finally abolished. Despite the hardships they faced, enslaved Jews persevered, and they played a vital role in the founding of the United States. Their contributions were essential to the survival of the Continental Army and the ultimate victory over the British. Enslaved Jews deserve our admiration and respect for their courage and their commitment to the ideals of freedom and democracy. So those are just 3 groups of Jews who helped America during the Revolutionary Era. Of course, there were many more individual patriots who risked their lives and their fortunes to help build a new nation. But the contributions of these 3 groups were essential to the survival of the United States. Without their help, it is unlikely that the Americans would have been able to win the war and establish a new nation based on the principles of liberty and democracy. And hey, if you want to learn more about the history of Jews in America, stay tuned because we'll be releasing more videos on this topic soon. In the last episode, we talked about how people of African descent and Native Americans were forcibly relocated during the 1800s, and we ended that episode with westward expansion. So now it's time to talk about how U.S. demographics changed in the 1800s through massive waves of immigration. Starting in the 1840s, more than 6 million European immigrants arrived in the United States, and most of them were fleeing persecution. Between 1840 and 1860 alone, almost 3 million new immigrants came to the United States. And today, we're going to learn where they came from, why they left their home countries, and how their experiences varied depending on when they got here and where they settled. So let's start with where all these new Americans actually came from, because it was pretty diverse. In the early 1800s, most immigrants to the United States were from Britain, Ireland, and China. The Irish began coming to the United States in the early 1800s because of potato famine. It had been raging in Ireland since 1845 and would continue to rage until the mid-1850s. The disease called potato blight destroyed potato crops, which caused widespread starvation and led to thousands of deaths. Between 1840 and 1850, over 1.5 million Irish immigrants arrived in the United States. Most were fleeing the potato famine, and most settled along the East Coast, where conditions were often bleak for these immigrants. They worked long hours for low wages in factories or took dangerous jobs like working on the docks. Unfortunately, anti-Irish prejudice ran high at this time, and many Protestants saw the Irish Catholics as a threat. The nativist or anti-immigrant movement gained steam during this era. Nativists believed that native-born Protestant Americans were being replaced by non-native Catholics, and they wanted to halt immigration and naturalization of foreigners. So the Irish faced a lot of discrimination. And if you've ever wondered where the term know nothing comes from, It's from this time period. But while the Irish faced horrible living conditions and discrimination, overall they were welcomed by the large number of Protestants, who also fled religious persecution in Britain and made up the majority of early American immigrants. These British immigrants tended to be middle class. Protestants who came to America seeking economic opportunities that were limited back home. But not everyone who immigrated during this time period was escaping something. Some were actually coming to the United States because of something. Jewish immigration increased during this time, and many were coming specifically from Germany and Central Europe. Over 2 million German immigrants arrived between 1840 and 1860. Many were fleeing political turmoil at home. After the 1848 revolutions across Europe, many liberals who participated in the failed revolutions were forced to leave Germany, and many chose the United States as their new home. This wave of German immigrants tended to be richer than earlier immigrants, and many became merchants, shopkeepers, and traders. They were also more likely to settle in rural areas and on the western frontier. And while anti-Semitism did exist in the United States, it wasn't nearly as prevalent as it was in Europe. So many German Jews found greater freedom of worship here. Overall, German immigrants fared pretty well in the United States and became an integral part of American society. And don't forget about the Chinese, who were mostly men who came to work on the railroads. And while their experience was also pretty brutal, they really helped the United States grow during this time period. Now, where these immigrants settled depended on when they arrived and why they came to the United States in the first place. For example, if they came during the mid-1800s, they probably came through one of two major ports, either in New York City or in Philadelphia. Early on, most immigrants passed through these cities and then traveled south or west. But after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, more immigrants passed through cities like Chicago and Cincinnati, Ohio, and San Francisco. Now, why they came to the United States also determined where they settled. For example, those fleeing the potato famine in Ireland settled primarily along the East Coast, especially in cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia. The Irish also worked in dangerous and difficult conditions and suffered high rates of death and illness. As a result, only about 15% of Irish immigrants stayed in the United States permanently. Those coming from Southern and Western Europe tended to come from more rural areas and settled in rural areas here. They worked as farmers and often bought land. And this is also where we see the beginnings of ethnic enclaves or neighborhoods populated primarily by people from the same culture or country. Meanwhile, most German immigrants were merchants, artisans, or industrial workers who came to cities looking for jobs. Like other European immigrants, most lived in ethnic enclaves in cities. In these communities, German immigrants published newspapers in their own language and celebrated German holidays. They also formed political organizations to advocate for their interests. And some states even had German-speaking judges and juries in courts. But while these ethnic enclaves provided a sense of community, they also reinforced prejudices against immigrants. Nativism, or prejudice against native-born Americans, grew in the 1840s and 1850s. We mentioned earlier how members of the Know-Nothing Party were motivated by fears that immigrants were taking jobs and undermining American culture. But it wasn't just Protestants who were prejudiced against immigrants. Many Americans of Jewish faith were also uncomfortable with the influx of German Jews in the United States. In addition to competing with them economically, many American Jews feared that the newcomers would bring their different customs and beliefs and corrupt American society. By the 1850s, nativism and anti-migrant feelings were growing in the United States. Meanwhile, Jews were experiencing a different kind of prejudice in the Western territories. When Jews moved to areas like Texas, they faced discrimination and violence from local residents who didn't want them there. So what did Jews do? They organized and created their own towns. Now we'll talk more about the growth of Jewish towns in a future episode. But for now, let's get back to the main narrative. The rapid influx of immigrants across the United States raised many questions about the role of slavery in national identity. and ultimately it played a role in sparking the Civil War. See, before the Civil War. The question of whether slavery should be allowed to expand into Western territories was a major point of contention between the North and the South. As the United States grew, more states were added to the country, and the question was whether those states would allow slavery or not. While Congress decided on the rules for admitting new states, territories admitted during this period, like Texas, didn't have to wait for Congress to decide. They could apply to become states on their own terms. To them, slavery contradicted the ideals upon which the United States was founded. But Southerners disagreed. They argued that slavery was necessary for the economic development of the South, and that it was sanctioned by the Constitution. Meanwhile, immigrants from Northern and Western Europe had little at stake in the debate over slavery, and generally didn't care if a new territory became a free state or a slave state. But immigrants from Central Europe, particularly Jews, had a lot to gain by supporting abolition of slavery. See, while enslaved people obviously had the most to gain by ending slavery. The fight to end slavery attracted a variety of allies who advocated for its end for different reasons. For some, it was about economic opportunity. For example, some northern factory owners preferred hiring free immigrant labor over enslaved people. Some immigrants, including German and Irish Catholics, joined the growing abolitionist movement because they saw parallels between the oppression of enslaved people and the struggles they had faced under oppressive regimes in their home countries. In fact, when the Civil War broke out, Jews fought on both the Union and Confederate sides. And the contributions of Jewish soldiers to the Union Army are significant. For example, Lieutenant Colonel Julius Stalhale served as an aide to General George McClellan and later led the 1st Regiment of African American troops. Sadly, prejudice still existed, and many Jewish soldiers faced discrimination despite their service. By the end of the Civil War, though, 100 years of growth had transformed the United States. The country went from a relatively small, sparsely populated nation to a much larger country that was much more densely populated and spanned from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. This transformation was due in large part to millions of immigrants who came to the country for a variety of reasons, including escaping persecution, finding better economic opportunities, and yes, even helping to build railroads. But the massive influx of immigrants wasn't the only thing that transformed the country during this time period. Slavery also underwent significant changes. And next time, we'll talk about how enslaved people resisted their oppression and ultimately won their freedom. Did you know that between the 1880s and the 1920s, over 2 million Jews fled to America? This was the biggest wave of immigration America had ever seen. And these weren't the first Jewish immigrants. The first Ashkenazi Jews arrived in the 1740s. But this new wave was different. It was bigger, and it changed America forever. Today, we're re-exploring what life was like for Jewish immigrants in the early 1900s in the United States. Why did Jews start immigrating to America in such large numbers in the 1880s? Well, primarily because of two things: persecution and poverty. Persecution, because in Eastern Europe, Jews were frequently victims of discrimination and violence, often blamed for societal problems. Poverty, because most lived in poverty, working long hours for low wages. So when the United States opened its doors with the promise of a better life, they fled to the U.S. in droves. Over 2 million Jews left their homelands between 1880 and 1924. That's almost half of the total Jewish population at the time. The majority of them entered the United States through Ellis Island, a small island in the New York Harbor. Ellis Island was the main immigration checkpoint for the U.S. between 1892 and 1954, over 17 million. Immigrants passed through its doors, including over half of all Jewish immigrants who came to the U.S. between 1892 and 1924. Imagine what that must have been like for them, leaving everything they knew behind, crossing the Atlantic Ocean for weeks, and arriving in America with little more than the clothes on their backs and perhaps a few precious belongings. The scene at Ellis Island was both chaotic and heartbreaking. Thousands of immigrants crowded the small island, waiting to be processed. Many were sick or injured from the long journey, and some had lost family members along the way. Still, there was hope in their eyes, the hope for a better life in America. But while Ellis Island was a symbol of hope for many immigrants, it was also a place of harsh realities. Most immigrants arriving at Ellis Island had little money and few job skills, making it difficult for them to find work or housing. They were often forced to live in overcrowded tenements and slums where disease and crime ran rampant. Despite these challenges, the Jewish immigrants persevered. They worked hard, saved money, and sent for their families to join them in America. Let's look into what life was actually like for these immigrants. Most Jewish immigrants lived in poverty. Many worked long hours for low wages in factories, sweatshops, or as domestic servants. Life was difficult, but they were determined to make a better life for themselves and their children. To escape poverty, many Jewish immigrants joined labor unions. These groups fought for workers' rights and better working conditions. They organized strikes and protests and helped improve the lives of Jewish immigrants across America. They also founded businesses. Though starting a business wasn't easy for Jewish immigrants, many were successful. They opened small shops and restaurants and became merchants and traders. Some even became millionaires. These businesses provided jobs and economic opportunities for other Jewish immigrants. They also helped preserve Jewish culture and traditions. For example, many Jewish immigrants opened kosher restaurants and delis to provide food that followed Jewish dietary laws. This helped maintain a sense of community and cultural continuity for Jewish immigrants far from their homeland. To preserve their culture, they also founded newspapers and schools. In Yiddish, these publications shared news and information with the Jewish community and helped immigrants integrate into American life while still maintaining their cultural identity. Schools taught Jewish history, culture, and language, ensuring that the next generation would be connected to their heritage. Despite the challenges they faced, Jewish immigrants made significant contributions to American society. Their hard work and determination helped improve working conditions for all Americans. This was a common goal among most immigrants, to assimilate into American culture and leave their old country ways behind. However, due to the mass influx of Jewish immigrants, it was impossible to assimilate everyone into American culture fast enough. So let's take a deeper look at this neighborhood and how it became the epicenter of Jewish life in America. After arriving in America, many Jewish immigrants settled in the Lower East Side in New York City. This neighborhood was located south of Chinatown and east of Little Italy. There were several reasons why this area was so appealing to Jewish immigrants. First, it was close to Ellis Island, making it easy for them to find work. Second, it was relatively inexpensive, allowing them to save money and send for their families. Third, it was already home to a growing Jewish community, providing a sense of familiarity and support. Life in the Lower East Side was tough, but the Jewish immigrants were determined to make the best of it. They worked hard, saved money, and sent for their families to join them in America. As more and more Jewish immigrants arrived in the Lower East Side, they began to transform the neighborhood. They opened businesses, founded schools, and built synagogues. They created a vibrant Jewish community in the heart of New York City. Sadly, the Lower East Side was also known for its poverty and overcrowding. Tenements were the typical form of housing in the area and often had terrible living conditions. Sanitation was poor, crime was high, and disease was rampant. Despite these challenges, the Jewish immigrants persevered. They worked hard to improve their lives and create a better future for their children. One of the ways they did this was by joining forces with other immigrant groups to fight for better living conditions. They organized protests and marches and lobbied the government to make changes. Their efforts led to improvements in housing, sanitation, and education, making the Lower East Side a better place to live. The Jewish immigrants also worked to preserve their culture and traditions, despite the challenges they faced. They founded schools to teach Yiddish and Hebrew and organized cultural events to celebrate their heritage. They also created newspapers and magazines that shared news and information with the Jewish community. The Lower East Side was truly a special place. It was a community of hard-working, resilient people who refused to give up in the face of adversity. They were determined to create a better life for themselves and their children, and they did just that. Their story is one of hope, perseverance, and the pursuit of the American dream. Now let us take a moment to explore some of the popular stereotypes about Jewish immigrants of the early 1900s and separate fact from fiction. Perhaps you've heard that they were all poor and uneducated. But that's not quite true. While many Jewish immigrants were indeed poor when they first arrived in America, this didn't mean they were uneducated. In fact, many were highly skilled professionals, merchants, and artisans. It's just that persecution and poverty in their homelands forced them to flee, and they had no choice but to take whatever work they could find to survive. What about the stereotype that they were all criminals? This is simply not true. Jewish immigrants were not more likely to commit crimes than any other group. In fact, many were victims of crime themselves, especially in the crowded and often unsafe neighborhoods where they lived. The reality is that Jewish immigrants were a diverse group of people from all walks of life, who came to America seeking a better future. They were not all poor and uneducated, nor were they all criminals. They were hard-working individuals who contributed greatly to American society and helped make it the great nation it is today. I hope you enjoyed learning more about Jewish immigrants in the early 1900s. Many of the world's problems today have their roots in the 20th century. Wars and economic crises that continue to haunt us long after the headlines have died down. But it was also a century of great achievements and progress. For American Jews, the 20th century began with promise and ended with triumph. The turn of the century saw thousands of Jews arriving in the United States every year, fleeing persecution and poverty in Europe. By 1900, there were over 500,000 Jews living in America, most of them concentrated in big cities like New York, where they formed ethnic enclaves with streets lined with Jewish shops, schools, and synagogues. But the rapid growth of these communities made assimilation into American society both inevitable and imperative. For American Jews to thrive, they would have to shed their foreign ways and become, as one prominent rabbi put it, Americanized. But antisemitism stood in their way. In many places, Jews faced discrimination in schools, jobs, and housing. They were denied admission to universities and country clubs. And when they did graduate from college, they were often unable to find work. Even when they did get hired, they were paid less than their colleagues and given menial tasks. Real estate agents routinely refused to rent or sell homes to Jews. Many families had to live in crowded tenement buildings in run-down neighborhoods. Others lived with relatives until they could afford their own place. One young man recalled sleeping with his 5 brothers and sisters in a room with his parents in an apartment above a noisy tavern. Despite these challenges, Jews slowly advanced. Many found work as peddlers, traveling salesmen, and shopkeepers, running small businesses that catered to their fellow immigrants. Over time, some of these neighborhood stores turned into chains that dominated the retail landscape. Department store magnates like Samuel Bronfman and Jesse Isidore Strauss built huge fortunes selling dry goods, while others like Nathan Strauss and Max Fishman focused on discount retailing. Other Jews went into finance, real estate, and manufacturing. By the end of the century, several hundred Jewish families dominated American business and owned much of the nation's wealth. Jews also distinguished themselves in science, labor, and the arts. Albert Einstein, born in Germany in 1879, immigrated to the United States in 1933. He was already famous for his theories of relativity, but he became even more celebrated for his opposition to nuclear weapons. Other scientists like Jonas Salk and David Ho developed life-saving vaccines and treatments for polio and HIV. Writers like Anzia Jazirska and Abraham Cahan captured the immigrant experience in powerful novels and short stories. Painters like Ben Shen and Jacob Lawrence depicted the lives of working people in vivid detail. And a new art form, jazz, owed much of its development to Jewish musicians like violinist and bandleader Dave Brubeck and pianist and composer George Gershwin. Perhaps no field was more influenced by Jewish talent, however, than Hollywood. Jewish directors, writers, producers, and actors created iconic films that are still beloved by audiences today. Louis B. Mayer founded the largest movie studio in Hollywood, which produced hundreds of films featuring stars like Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, and the Marx Brothers. Other studios followed suit, and soon Jews were running all 8 major film companies. Jewish comedians like Charlie Chaplin and Ben Blue brought laughter to millions, and Jewish intellectuals like screenwriter Bud Schulberg helped shape Hollywood's social conscience. At the same time, though, Jewish stereotypes flourished. Anti-Semites exploited the power of film to reinforce harmful caricatures of Jews as greedy, dishonest, and unpatriotic. Some movies portrayed Jews as sinister plotters seeking to control the government or as grotesque physical oddities. These stereotypes seeped into the minds of millions of Americans and poisoned relations between Jews and their neighbors. Then came World War II. For American Jews, the war was a time of anxiety and mobilization. As the war in Europe intensified, newspapers carried stories about Nazi atrocities against Jews. At the same time, the U.S. government encouraged American Jews to support the war effort and enlist in the military. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish men and women served with distinction. Many joined the newly formed Jewish chaplaincy to minister to the spiritual needs of their comrades. Others volunteered for civilian service, raising money, collecting supplies, and caring for refugees. Yet, despite their contributions, American Jews were caught in a quandary. As the war dragged on, public opinion turned against relaxing immigration quotas to admit Jewish refugees fleeing the Nazis. By the end of the conflict, 90% of European Jews had been murdered and millions more had been imprisoned in concentration camps. It was the greatest humanitarian crisis in history. In the aftermath, American Jews found themselves at a crossroads. Should they assimilate fully and leave their heritage behind, or should they preserve their traditions and defy the melting pot? The answer, as it turned out, was yes. Over the next decades, American Jews began to define a new kind of Judaism, one that combined traditional observance with full participation in American life. This movement, known as Jewish renewal, took hold in the 1960s when a new generation of rabbis began experimenting with new forms of worship. Conservative and Reform rabbis began incorporating Hebrew prayer and study into services, while Orthodox rabbis modernized their rituals and opened their congregations to more diverse groups of Jews. Synagogues sprang up across the country and membership surged. Day schools, overnight camps, and youth groups flourished, giving a new generation of Jews an opportunity to explore their heritage. At the same time, interest in Israel surged, and hundreds of thousands of American Jews moved there to build new lives. Many of them returned to the United States, however, bringing with them a new vision of Jewish life that combined ancient traditions with modern sensibilities. Today, American Jews enjoy unprecedented levels of wealth, success, and influence. Jewish organizations play a major role in politics and philanthropy. Jewish museums, theaters, and cultural centers enrich our cities. And Jewish chefs, artists, and entrepreneurs continue to innovate and push the boundaries. Yet, anti-Semitism persists. Just last year, a Jewish college student was harassed for wearing a yarmulke on her university campus, and a Jewish high school was firebombed in a suspected hate crime. What does this mean for the future of American Jews? As we conclude our series on the Jewish people, let's take a look at how American Jews are responding to these challenges and ensuring that their culture and religion endure for generations to come. For centuries, Jews have been at the forefront of social change, fighting for justice and equality for all. In the 20th century, American Jews played a pivotal role in the labor movement, advocating for workers' rights and helping to organize unions. They fought for civil rights, demanding equal access to education, housing, and employment for African Americans. They led the way in the fight for women's suffrage and reproductive rights. And they were instrumental in the passage of landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990. Their commitment to social justice continues today as American Jews work to address income inequality, healthcare disparities, and environmental degradation. They are also at the forefront of the fight for gun control, LGBTQ rights, and religious freedom. At the same time, American Jews have been active participants in American civic life. They have served in elected office, appointed positions, and on boards and commissions. They have worked tirelessly to strengthen communities and improve the lives of their fellow citizens. They have been teachers, doctors, lawyers, business leaders, and philanthropists. They have enriched our nation's cultural and intellectual life through their contributions to the arts, sciences, and humanities. They have made our communities more vibrant and our country more prosperous. But perhaps most important is the example they have set for all Americans. Through their commitment to justice, equality, and democracy, American Jews have shown us what it means to be a true patriot. They have taught us that patriotism is not about blind obedience or uncritical support of authority. It is about speaking out against injustice, standing up for what is right, and working to make our country a better place for all. So, as we conclude our series on the Jewish people, let us take a moment to celebrate the contributions of American Jews and the values they have brought to our nation. Let us remember that it was American Jews who helped build our labor unions, advance civil rights, and protect the environment. Let us recall that it was American Jews who have served in public office, mentored students, and led our cultural institutions. And let us never forget that it was American Jews who have taught us the true meaning of patriotism. In a time when antisemitism and other forms of intolerance seem all too prevalent, it is important to remember the valuable contributions that Jewish people have made to our society. The Jewish community has a rich history in America dating back to the early colonial period. And today, American Jews are an integral part of the fabric of American life. They are our neighbors, friends, and colleagues. They are the people who make our communities stronger and our country better. We should celebrate their contributions and honor their legacy. Antisemitism is a dangerous form of prejudice that has no place in our society. It is important to speak out against antisemitism and all forms of intolerance in order to create a more inclusive and welcoming world for everyone. As we look to the future, let us strive to create a world that embraces diversity and celebrates the contributions of all people, regardless of their religion or background. Let us remember the lessons of the past and work towards a better, more tolerant, and compassionate future for all. When we think of the Civil Rights Movement, we tend to focus on the struggles of African Americans during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. But what many people do unrealize is that many Jews were right there alongside their black brothers and sisters, fighting for equality and an end to racism. In this video, we're going to look at how Jews and Judaism contributed to the fight for civil rights. As always, let me know what you think down below. And if you like what my team and I are doing, be sure to subscribe and share this video with your friends. The Civil Rights Movement was a decades-long struggle by blacks to achieve equal rights and opportunities in America. Beginning in the 1950s and lasting through the 1970s, it was a time when African Americans across the South and eventually the entire nation began to fight back against the laws and customs that kept them from being treated equally. They faced brutal opposition from white Southerners who wanted to maintain the status quo, but they persevered, and eventually their hard work paid off. But while African Americans were on the front lines, Jewish Americans played an integral role in advancing the cause of civil rights. The Jewish community has long had an activist tradition. In fact, one could argue that the Jewish tradition calls for social justice and fighting for the underdog. So it's not surprising that so many Jews were involved in the civil rights movement. Let us start by looking at the historical roots of Jewish involvement in the struggle for black civil rights. After all, Blacks and Jews have shared a history in America that dates back almost as far as the country itself. To understand the relationship between Jews and African Americans, it's important to go back to the beginning. The first Jews arrived in North America in the early 1600s. They were mostly Sephardic Jews who had been expelled from Spain and Portugal. Over the next century, more Jews would come to America, fleeing persecution in Europe. The majority of these immigrants were Ashkenazim, which means they had German, Polish, or Russian ancestry. As the United States grew, so did its Jewish population. In the mid-1800s, the first wave of large-scale immigration from Europe brought thousands of Jews to America every year. By the turn of the century, there were over 2 million Jews living in the United States. This rapid influx of immigrants led to tensions with some native-born Americans who saw the newcomers as a threat. But despite the challenges they faced, Jews quickly began to make contributions to American society. They started businesses, became active in politics, and founded schools and hospitals. African Americans, on the other hand, had been in America since before it was even a country. Enslaved people from Africa had been brought to the British colony of Virginia in the early 1600s, and by the time the United States was founded, there were tens of thousands of enslaved blacks living in the South. After the American Revolution, the institution of slavery continued to grow, and by 1860, over 4 million people were enslaved in the United States. The Civil War was fought in large part over the issue of slavery. And after the war, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution abolished slavery and granted citizenship and voting rights to African American men. But in practice, the South resisted these changes and enforced a system of racial segregation and disenfranchisement, known as Jim Crow. So that's a bit of the history. Now, let's get into the movement. In the early 1900s, there was a growing movement for civil rights for African Americans. Leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington demanded an end to Jim Crow and the right to vote. But it wasn't until the 1950s that this movement really began to gain momentum. In 1954, the landmark Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education declared racial segregation in schools unconstitutional. This victory was hard-won, and it faced fierce resistance in the South. But it was a major step forward for the civil rights movement. As the movement grew, so did the need for legal assistance. Enter the Jewish lawyers. Jewish lawyers were at the forefront of the fight for civil rights. They worked tirelessly to dismantle the legal system that upheld segregation and discrimination. One of the most important contributions of Jewish lawyers was their work in the courts. They argued cases before the Supreme Court that struck down discriminatory laws. For example, in 1962, a group of Jewish lawyers filed a lawsuit that challenged the constitutionality of racial segregation in public accommodations. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, where it was decided in favor of the plaintiff. This victory was a major step forward in the fight for equal access to public facilities. But it wasn't just in the courts that Jewish lawyers made an impact. They also played a key role in drafting legislation that advanced the cause of civil rights. For example, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, outlawing discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin. This landmark legislation was the result of years of work by civil rights advocates, including many Jewish lawyers. Jewish lawyers weren't the only ones contributing to the movement, though. Jewish activists were also on the ground, working to register voters, organize protests, and raise awareness about the struggle for civil rights. One of the most important contributions of Jewish activists was their work in voter registration drives. In the South, African Americans were routinely denied the right to vote through intimidation, violence, and even murder. But Jewish activists were determined to change that. They worked tirelessly to register black voters and help them participate in the political process. For example, in the early 1960s, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was a student-led organization that played a key role in the civil rights movement. SNCC was founded in 1960 by black and white students from different colleges in the South, and it quickly became one of the most important groups in the movement. SNCC members organized sit-ins, freedom rides, and voter registration drives, and they faced brutal opposition from white Southerners. But they persevered, and eventually their hard work paid off. Another important contribution of Jewish activists was their work in organizing protests. Protests were an important part of the civil rights movement, and they often drew the attention of the media. This helped to raise awareness about the struggle for civil rights and put pressure on lawmakers to pass legislation. For example, in 1963, Jewish activists played a key role in organizing the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This massive demonstration in support of civil rights legislation was one of the most important events in the movement. It was during this march that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. The Jewish community's involvement in the civil rights movement was truly remarkable. Jewish lawyers and activists made significant contributions to the struggle for equal rights and an end to racism. Their work helped to change the course of American history and create a more just and equitable society. It's important to remember that the civil rights movement was a long and difficult struggle. But ultimately, it was successful in achieving its goals. And Jewish Americans played an integral role in that success. So why do you think so many Jews were involved in the civil rights movement? What do you think? Let me know down below. If you liked this video, be sure to check out some of our other videos on the channel. We've got a ton of great content coming up. Thanks for watching. Hello, my name is Anonymous. I am a representative of a major city, and I've been asked by the State Department to come here today and speak to you about the history of the Jews in America. Now, when you think of people coming to the United States, you probably imagine somebody coming across this way from Europe. But the first Jews actually came to what we now call the United States. Before it was the United States, before it was even discovered by Europeans. The first Jews came here with the Spanish conquistadors, with the explorers who were looking for gold, jewels, and, of course, Godot. There were some Jews among that group. However, the real story of the Jews in America begins after the founding of the United States. And it begins with our first president, George Washington. George Washington invited Jews to come to the United States. He said, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union." George Washington welcomed the Jews into the new nation, and so it began. Jews started coming to the United States from all over the world. Jews from England came because they were escaping religious persecution. They were seeking a better life for themselves and their families. Jews from Germany came and made incredible contributions to our early states. In fact, the first governor of the state of Rhode Island was a Jew named John Collins. In the 1800s, we saw waves of immigration from Russia, from Eastern Europe. These were Jews who were fleeing pogroms. They were seeking to find a better life here in America. Some of them settled in New York City. Many of them eventually found their way south to states like Georgia and Texas. Today, the U.S. is home to the second largest Jewish population in the world, after Israel, with about 6 to 7 million Jews. We are spread out all over the country. You will find us in large cities like New York or Los Angeles. You will find us in smaller cities. You will even find us in rural areas. And we are part of the fabric of American life. Many of us still maintain ties to our European heritage, to our cultural traditions, to our language, whether that's Yiddish or Hebrew. And yet we have created an American culture. We have created an American identity that is very much our own. The Jewish contributions to America are too numerous to mention in just a few minutes, but let me highlight a few. Let's begin with Albert Einstein, one of the most brilliant scientists of the 20th century. Or consider the state of Israel. When Israel was founded in 1948, many people thought it was doomed to fail. But along comes an American president, Harry Truman, who recognized the right of Israel to exist. From there, the relationship between the two countries has only grown stronger. I could talk about the contributions of Jews in business, in science, in entertainment, in culture. And it would take hours. I could talk about the thousands of scientists who helped to develop America's space program. I could talk about the countless doctors who saved lives. I could talk about the leaders of some of America's most iconic companies. I could talk about Hollywood and the impact that Jews have had on movies and television. I could talk about how Jews have shaped American taste in food. I mean, bagels, pizza, pickles, cheesecake. All these things are now staples of American cuisine. And then there's the issue of civil rights. When you think about the great struggle for civil rights here in America, you may not think about Jews. Yet Jews were among the earliest and most ardent supporters of the civil rights movement. Think about it. When Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. went to a deli in the South to get a sandwich, and the man behind the counter refused to serve him that S. When Dr. King decided that he would never eat at a Jewish deli again until Jews began to treat African Americans as equals. Well, a young man named Bernie Marcus heard those words. He was a manager at a Jewish deli, and he decided that he was going to do something about it. So he and a partner opened up a new deli, the first integrated restaurant in the South. That little deli became the catalyst for the desegregation of Atlanta. It wasn't long before other delis followed suit. And this was just one example of the Jewish commitment to civil rights. Jews have always believed in the equality of all people, regardless of race, color, or creed. That is why it was so shocking when, in 1989, 6 Jewish men were murdered in a hate crime in New York City. The killer was a skinhead, but he didn't choose his victims at random. He chose them because they were Jewish. And this is the challenge that we face today. Jews have always been a minority in America. We've always been outsiders. And when you are a minority, when you are an outsider, sometimes people don't understand you. Sometimes they're afraid of you. Sometimes they blame you for their own problems. And that's where the anti-Semitism comes in. I'm here in Jerusalem at the beautiful Hebrew University. I'm standing in front of the Cardozo School of Law, and I want to tell you about a conversation I had with a student here. This student, a young woman, was raised in Israel. She speaks Hebrew better than I do, but she comes to the United States, and she falls in love with a Jewish American man. They decide to settle in the United States, and she says to me, "What should I expect? What should I know about living in the United States?" And I told her exactly what I'm telling you. I told her that she find wonderful communities of Jews who will welcome her with open arms. She'll find other Jews who may not be so welcoming. She'll find anti-Semites who will try to tear down everything that she and her family stand for. And I said, you have to be strong. You have to be proud of who you are. You have to teach your children who they are and what they stand for. And you must never back down. And she took all this in. And then she asked me a question. She said, "Are the people who hate Jews worse than the people who hate Israelis?" And I looked at her and I said, "No, they're not worse. They're different." I said, "Here in Israel, you face physical attacks. People throw stones at you. They try to run you off the road. They might stab you or shoot you because of who you are, because of what you believe in." And I said, when I walk down the street in America, no one's throwing stones at me. No one's trying to run me off the road. It's not physical, it's verbal. People scream at me. They yell at me. They say terrible things about my family and about God, and they say they wish we were dead. And I said, it's not as physical, but it's just as ugly. So that's the challenge that we face today, that we have always faced. It is the challenge of anti-Semitism. But we have overcome it time and time again. And I know that you, if you ever encounter a Jew in the United States, you will see that we are normal people. We are your friends and neighbors. We are the people that you can count on. We are the people that you want to have on your team. We're the kind of people who make the world a better place. And we look forward to welcoming you to the United States. Thank you very much. The Jewish experience in America can be traced back to the early 17th century. when the first Jewish settlers arrived in New Amsterdam, now New York. These individuals were part of a group of 23 refugees who fled religious persecution in Brazil, where they had been expelled by the Portuguese authorities. Despite facing challenges and discrimination, these pioneers persevered and established themselves in the New World. One notable figure among them was a leader who played a crucial role in shaping the community. He was born in Amsterdam to a family that had converted to Christianity under Dutch influence, but later returned to Judaism. Realizing the significance of their presence, he initiated the construction of the first synagogue in North America in 1658, a testament to their commitment to preserving their faith and identity. As the years passed, more Jewish immigrants arrived in America seeking refuge from persecution and poverty in Europe. Many of them settled in the southern colonies, including Georgia, where they faced restrictions on land ownership and religious practices. However, some found opportunities in the growing city of Savannah, contributing to its development through trade and commerce. One prominent example was Haim Salomon, a Jewish merchant and financier who provided crucial support to George Washington during the American Revolutionary War. His contributions not only helped the Continental Army, but also demonstrated the loyalty and patriotism of Jewish Americans towards their adopted country. During this period, the Jewish population in America remained relatively small, with most European Jews still unaware of the opportunities and freedoms that existed in the New World. However, everything changed with the advent of the 19th century. The 19th century marked a turning point in Jewish immigration to America. The beginning of the century saw a wave of German Jews arriving, primarily from the region of Bavaria. These immigrants were largely skilled artisans, merchants, and professionals who sought economic advancement and personal freedom in the United States. They contributed significantly to various fields, including manufacturing, finance, and intellectual pursuits. For instance, many German Jewish immigrants played vital roles in the industrialization of cities like New York and Philadelphia, establishing businesses and employing fellow immigrants. Others, like financiers, became key players in Wall Street, shaping the financial landscape of America. However, the mid-19th century witnessed a dramatic shift in the demographics of Jewish immigration. This was due to a combination of factors, including severe anti-Jewish policies in Russia, the desire for land ownership, and the allure of economic opportunities in America. Russian Jews made up the majority of those who came during this time. Unlike their German counterparts, many were fleeing persecution and had limited means, often settling in impoverished urban areas. Despite the hardships they faced, Russian Jewish immigrants demonstrated remarkable resilience and determination. They worked long hours in factories and sweatshops to make ends meet and eventually began to establish schools and synagogues to preserve their cultural heritage. One significant destination for these immigrants was the Lower East Side in New York City, which became a hub for Jewish culture and community. Within this neighborhood, smaller communities formed based on regional origins, such as the Lithuanian and the Galician Jews. Over time, these communities grew, providing mutual aid and support to their members and contributing to the rich cultural tapestry of the Lower East Side. In the late 19th century, the United States implemented new immigration policies that had a profound impact on Jewish migration patterns. Prior to this time, most immigrants, including Jews, entered the country without restrictions. However, the passage of restrictive laws resulted in a decrease in the number of Jews coming to America. This shift led many to seek refuge in other countries, particularly in Great Britain, Canada, and Argentina. Nonetheless, the allure of the United States remained strong, and a steady stream of Jewish immigrants continued to arrive throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The reasons behind this continued migration were multifaceted. Economic opportunities, religious freedom, and escaping persecution were among the top motivations for those who dared to cross the Atlantic. But the journey itself was fraught with challenges. Crossing the ocean in steerage, the cheapest accommodations available on ships, was a perilous and uncomfortable experience. Disease, injury, and even death were common occurrences during these transatlantic voyages. Despite the hardships endured during their arrival, these immigrants were greeted by the promise of a new life in America. Cities like New York City, Boston, and Chicago welcomed them with open arms, offering a chance at a better future. Once there, they often settled in ethnic enclaves, where they could find familiar faces and maintain a sense of community. Within these neighborhoods, they established businesses, schools, and places of worship that celebrated their heritage while adapting to their new surroundings. At the beginning of the 20th century, Jewish immigration to the United States saw a surge due to multiple factors. Persecution, poverty, and political turmoil in Eastern Europe, particularly in the Russian Empire and Austria-Hungary, drove many Jews to seek refuge and opportunity in America. This influx of immigrants was diverse, with people from various regions of Eastern Europe, including Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, arriving in significant numbers. They faced challenging conditions, often living in overcrowded tenements and working long hours and low-wage jobs. Despite these hardships, they persevered, forming tight-knit communities that offered mutual support and a sense of belonging in an unfamiliar land. In response to the influx of immigrants, various organizations sprang up to assist with settlement and assimilation into American life. These included educational institutions like Hebrew schools to preserve cultural heritage and religious schools like Talmud Torah to transmit Jewish values. Additionally, benevolent societies and mutual aid groups provided essential services and relief during times of need. Notable examples include the Jewish Educational Committee and the United Hebrew Charities. These organizations played a crucial role in helping immigrants navigate the challenges of a new country, ensuring that they had access to education, healthcare, and social services. Furthermore, synagogues and temples served as centers of community and worship, offering a familiar and comforting space amidst the challenges of a rapidly changing environment. These institutions not only provided spiritual guidance, but also organized social events and activities that fostered a sense of continuity and cultural pride. Throughout the early 20th century, Jewish immigrants continued to arrive in the United States, each wave bringing with it the hopes and dreams of a better life. Their contributions to American society were vast, ranging from advancements in science and industry to cultural and intellectual achievements. Despite facing prejudice and discrimination, Jewish Americans demonstrated resilience and determination in pursuing their goals. Over time, they integrated into American society while preserving their cultural heritage, leaving an indelible mark on the nation's cultural landscape. However, the road to equality was not easy. Antisemitism persisted, and Jewish Americans fought tirelessly against prejudice and discrimination to secure their place in society. Despite these challenges, Jewish communities flourished. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles became home to vibrant cultural centers. Theaters, restaurants, and schools that celebrated Jewish heritage. Landmarks like the Jewish Museum in New York and the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles stand as testaments to the rich history and contributions of Jewish Americans. The mid-20th century brought both progress and challenges for Jewish Americans. On one hand, they achieved significant milestones in civil rights and representation. On the other hand, they faced new forms of discrimination and prejudice. The rise of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s highlighted the ongoing struggle for equality and justice. Jewish Americans, along with other minority groups, actively participated in this movement, advocating for equal access to education, employment, and public facilities. The fight for civil rights was not without its complexities. Tensions sometimes arose between Jewish leaders and activists who advocated for the needs of their respective communities. However, these tensions were often overcome. Recognizing the shared struggles and goals in the pursuit of a more inclusive society. As the 20th century progressed, Jewish Americans continued to make significant contributions to various fields. In science, medicine, and technology, they achieved groundbreaking advancements. Figures like Albert Einstein, a physicist, and Jonas Salk, a medical researcher, left an enduring legacy on our understanding of the world. Furthermore, Jewish Americans excelled in the arts, with artists, writers, and musicians gaining international acclaim. Names like Leonard Bernstein, a composer, and Arthur Miller, a playwright, became synonymous with excellence and innovation. Despite these achievements, antisemitism reared its head periodically, reminding Jewish Americans of the importance of vigilance and perseverance in the face of bigotry. Incidents of hate and discrimination, though disheartening, were met with determination and activism. Jewish communities, along with allies from other backgrounds, organized protests, legal challenges, and educational initiatives to combat prejudice and promote tolerance. Landmarks like the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. serve as solemn reminders of the horrors of the past and the importance of remembrance and education in preventing future atrocities. Today, Jewish Americans represent a diverse tapestry of backgrounds, perspectives, and experiences. They come from various countries of origin, including Russia, Poland, Germany, and Israel, each bringing with them unique cultural traditions and perspectives that enrich the fabric of American society. This diversity is evident in the various Jewish holidays and customs that are celebrated, such as Passover, Hanukkah, and Rosh Hashanah. These holidays, with their rich symbolism and traditions, not only connect Jewish Americans to their heritage, but also serve as a reminder of their historical journey and the importance of preserving their cultural identity. Furthermore, Jewish Americans have made significant contributions to philanthropy and social justice causes. The Jewish tradition of Tikkun Olam, which emphasizes repairing the world, has inspired countless individuals to dedicate their time and resources to making a positive impact. Jewish Americans have been at the forefront of numerous charitable endeavors, addressing issues such as poverty, inequality, and environmental protection. One notable example is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which has provided vital aid and support to communities around the world, including refugees and survivors of disasters. Moreover, Jewish Americans have actively engaged in political and civic life, advocating for policies and candidates that align with their values and beliefs. They have held influential positions in government, judiciary, and diplomacy, working to shape a better future for their communities and the nation as a whole. The legacy of Jewish Americans is one of resilience, achievement, and a deep commitment to making a positive impact on the world. From their early days as refugees seeking a new life to their contributions to various fields and their fight for equality and justice, Jewish Americans have left an indelible mark on the story of the United States as they continue to navigate the challenges and opportunities of the 21st century. Their unwavering spirit and dedication to their heritage and the betterment of society serve as an inspiration to all.